When Sylvester Stallone and his two longtime friends decided to ride their motorcycles across a long, desolate highway, they were simply looking to reclaim a piece of the road and their youth. But out of nowhere, they were intercepted by a group of local punks, reckless, loud, and looking for trouble. The gang blocked the road and deliberately provoked them, not realizing they had picked the absolute worst men to mess with. What started as an act of intimidation quickly turned into a lesson they'd never forget. The story took place on a quiet afternoon that stretched endlessly along what locals call the loneliest road in America. No billboards, no gas stations, just the low roar of three bikes slicing through open desert like war horses crossing a forgotten battlefield. Leading the pack was a black Harley-Davidson Softail Deluxe, its chrome glinting like polished silver in the Nevada sun. The man riding it looked like he belonged to another era, older, broader in the shoulders, his face lined with the weight of years and memory. His name was Sylvester Stallone. Not the Hollywood icon in a tuxedo on red carpets, but the man behind the image. A fighter, a survivor, someone who had spent a lifetime walking the razor-thin line between glory and grief. He wore a beat-up leather jacket, dusty jeans, and a half-helmet that left most of his weathered face exposed. His jaw was set tight, but his eyes were calm and focused. Riding just behind him was Frankie Malone, a former Navy SEAL with a prosthetic left leg and a past that needed no explanation. Beside him was Hank Pops Delaney, a retired stuntman turned motorcycle mechanic whose wrists popped every time he shifted gears. They weren't trying to make a statement. They weren't chasing lost youth or faded fame. They were just three old friends taking back a stretch of road before winter came, and their knees couldn't take the cold anymore. That morning, they'd left Fallon, passed through Austin after lunch, and now they were riding toward Ely, a sleepy town nestled in the shadow of Nevada's eastern mountains. All they wanted was a cold beer at sundown, a quiet bed that didn't creak, and maybe a little peace. But peace, out here, didn't always mean safety. Roughly 30 miles outside Ely, just past a sun-faded Texaco sign hanging crooked on a rusted pole, a black Chevy Express van pulled up behind them. It had no license plates, just a dust-coated body and windows tinted darker than the law allowed. At first, Stallone didn't think much of it. Vehicles came and went out here. Most meant no harm, but this one stayed close. Too close. Then, just as they neared a wide gravel turnout near an abandoned rest stop, the van surged forward and swerved sharply, cutting them off. Gravel flew as the three bikers hit their brakes, tires kicking up clouds of dust. Stallone balanced the Harley with one hand while the other gripped the throttle. Frankie scanned the horizon like the soldier he still was. Pops shifted nervously in his seat, older instincts stirring to life. Then came the sound of a van door sliding open, a sharp metallic clang. 5 young men jumped out. Bandanas covered their faces, work gloves on their hands. One held a crowbar. Another snapped open a switchblade with a cold metallic click. The others gripped pipes or stood tall with puffed-up bravado. They looked like local kids, young, desperate, high on adrenaline, and a delusion of power. They thought they were wolves surrounding easy prey. What they didn't know was that they had walked straight into the story of a legend. Their leader, tall and wiry, with a scar running from cheekbone to chin, stepped forward and spat in the dirt. "Nice bikes," he sneered, voice muffled under the cloth but full of arrogance. Bet they'd run a lot smoother without a bunch of old men slowing them down. Stallone didn't respond right away. He calmly removed his helmet and lifted it off, revealing a face that anyone who had watched movies in the last 50 years would recognize in an instant. But these kids didn't. They weren't from that generation. They hadn't grown up with Rocky or First Blood. To them, he was just another old man on a fancy bike, too slow to fight back, too far from help. "Look," Stallone said, his voice steady and low, like distant thunder on an open plain. "You really don't want to do this." The scarred leader laughed. "And what are you gonna do, Grandpa? Hit me with your walker?" He took another step forward, while his crew spread out behind him, clanking weapons against their palms, like they'd rehearsed the scene from some bad movie. "What's your plan? Give us a speech?" One of them reached for the saddlebag on Stallone's Harley. That was the last straw. Moving faster than anyone expected for a man his age, Stallone stepped off the bike and grabbed the kid's wrist, twisting it hard enough to send the crowbar clattering to the ground. Before the others could react, he slammed an elbow into the kid's chest. Quick, clean, brutal. The boy collapsed with a wheeze like a deflated tire. Another attacker lunged forward, swinging a pipe, but Stallone ducked low and delivered a vicious left hook to the ribs. Bone cracked. Pops joined in, swinging his helmet like a hammer and knocking one of them flat. Frankie, always calm under pressure, used his prosthetic leg to sweep another off balance and then dropped a knee to his throat, pinning him to the ground with military precision. In less than 30 seconds, 4 of the 5 were either unconscious or staggering. The 5th, the leader, stumbled backward, trembling, his hand diving into his jacket. He pulled out a compact pistol, holding it with the clumsy, desperate grip of someone who'd never really fired one before. His voice cracked. "Don't come any closer. I swear I'll shoot." Stallone didn't blink. He took one slow step forward, eyes locked on the boy's shaking hands. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "Pull that trigger, and your life changes forever." The kid tried to steady his aim, but his breathing was shallow, erratic. He didn't understand what he was up against. He thought this was still a game. "You know who I am?" Stallone asked, not from pride, but with the calm weariness of a man who'd fought more battles than he could count. "You really want to find out what happens next?" The leader hesitated. His arm dropped slightly. His eyes darted to his friends groaning in the dust. The bravado drained from his face like water through cracked pavement. Then finally, the gun slipped from his grip and landed softly on the gravel. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a siren began to rise, a sharp, thin cry echoing across the empty plains. The kid bolted, dragging one of his injured friends toward the van. The others followed, limping, bruised, and wide-eyed. The engine fired up, and the van peeled away, tires spinning, leaving behind only dust, fear, and a hard-earned lesson. Stallone bent down and picked up the pistol, flipping open the chamber. Empty, just as he expected. "Damn kid didn't even load it," he muttered. Frankie handed him a bottle of water. Pop stretched his back and grumbled, "Well, hell of a retirement ride." Stallone took a long drink, wiped the dust from his face with his sleeve, and looked down the highway. Quiet again, endless, but not lonely. Not with these 2 beside him. "Still got gas in the tank," he said, climbing back on the Harley. The engines roared to life once more, and 3 old legends disappeared into the desert dusk, leaving behind tire tracks, bruised egos, and a story that highway would never forget. They rode into Ely under a velvet sky speckled with desert stars, the kind of sky you could only see out west, where the horizon never seemed to end, and the silence felt almost sacred. The town was quiet, the way small towns get after 9 p.m. A couple neon signs flickering outside shuttered bars, the soft hum of a jukebox leaking through the screen door of the Lucky Buck Saloon, and the distant bark of a dog that no one ever seemed to see. Stallone and his crew pulled into a dusty old motor lodge just off Altman Street. The sign said Moonlight Inn, and one of the O's was flickering like it couldn't decide whether to give up or hang on. It reminded Stallone of himself some days. They parked the bikes, checked in, and didn't say much after that. Each man had seen their fair share of fights, but there was something about fighting when you're older. It lingers longer in your bones, hums a little lower in your ribs. You don't just shake it off like when you were 25. The adrenaline fades, but the ache stays. Inside his room, Stallone sat on the edge of the bed, unlacing his boots with slow, steady hands. The wallpaper was faded, and the air smelled faintly of old coffee and pine disinfectant. He looked at himself in the mirror above the dresser. Not the Stallone of red carpets, not even the Stallone of training montages, but the man who had grown up in Hell's Kitchen, who used to fight in underground clubs for cab fare, who once slept in a bus station for 3 nights straight. The same eyes stared back, only now they carried more stories than fists. He ran a hand through his graying hair, his knuckles still red from the scuffle. He didn't regret it, not a second of it, but he also didn't feel triumphant. Not anymore. There was no victory in beating a kid too dumb to realize he was about to ruin his own life. There was only necessity. The next morning, the 3 men met for coffee at a diner called Ruthie's Place, just a block from the motel. It was the kind of place with checkered curtains, vinyl booths that stuck to your thighs, and a waitress who called everyone Hon, no matter how rough they looked. Her name was Janine, probably in her late 50s, and when she poured Stallone's black coffee, she gave him a look like she recognized him but couldn't quite place him. "You a rodeo man?" she asked, her pen poised over the notepad. "Used to be," Stallone answered, half smiling. She chuckled and nodded. "Thought so. You've got the hands for it." As they ate their eggs and toast, the conversation was sparse. Frankie mostly just stared out the window, still wired from the night before. Pops grumbled something about his back, then asked Stallone if he thought the Van Punks would come back. Stallone shook his head. They had their shot. Next time, they won't be so brave. They finished up, tipped Janine a 20, and were heading out when a sheriff's cruiser pulled into the lot. The man behind the wheel was broad-shouldered, mustached, with the steady gait of someone who'd worked small-town law enforcement long enough to know what not to get excited about. He stepped out, adjusted his belt, and looked straight at Stallone. "You fellas the ones stayed at Moonlight last night?" he asked. Stallone nodded, straightening his jacket. "That us." The sheriff glanced at the bruised knuckles, then at the bikes, then back at the 3 men, like he was putting together a slow-motion puzzle. "Name's Sheriff Tom Keller," he said finally, extending a hand. "We got a report about a busted-up van outside of Ely. 4 guys inside, 1 in the hospital. They were talking about a bunch of old men who ambushed them on the highway." He chuckled. "Doesn't sound like any senior citizens I know." Pops let out a snort. Frankie didn't even blink. Stallone shook his hand. "They came after us with weapons. tried to take our bikes. One of them pulled a gun." Keller nodded slowly. "That's what they told the ER nurse. Also said one of you might have been in the movies or something." Stallone didn't respond, just gave the sheriff a small shrug. "We handled it without bloodshed," he said. "Mostly." The sheriff nodded again, longer this time. "Well, I appreciate you not leaving bodies. A lot of folks around here wouldn't be that generous." He looked off toward the rising sun, hands resting on his hips. "Still, those boys ain't done. I know the type. If they're smart, they'll keep driving east and never look back. But if they're dumb, and I'd bet my badge they are, they'll want to finish what they started." Stallone looked out toward the road. He didn't like leaving things half-finished, but he wasn't a young man spoiling for a fight either. "Let's hope they choose smart," he said. By noon, they were back on the highway, rolling through the empty basin lands, nothing but brush and rocks and mountains in the distance. There was a strange peace in the desolation, a comfort in the absence of noise. They rode for miles without speaking, the rhythm of the road doing the talking. But just as they crested a gentle rise near the outskirts of Great Basin National Park, they saw it, the same black Chevy Express, pulled over on the side of the road, hood up like a wounded animal. And standing next to it, 4 of the same kids from the night before. No weapons this time, no posturing, just faces covered in sweat and dust. One of them raised a hand in what might have been a wave, or maybe a plea. Frankie slowed first. Pops hesitated. Stallone rolled up beside them and stared at the scene for a long moment. Then, without a word, he pulled to the shoulder and killed the engine. The others followed suit. The kid with the scar stepped forward slowly, hands in the air. "Look, we're not here to fight," he said. His voice cracked, like it hadn't rested since last night. "We ran out of gas, and we left our phones in the van. We've been walking for an hour trying to flag someone down. Nobody stopped." Stallone kept his sunglasses on, his voice low and dry. "Maybe it's because you scared everyone off with those masks and weapons yesterday." The kid looked down, shame creeping into his posture. "We messed up. Bad. I know. I just, we thought we could get a few bucks. Maybe pawn the bikes. We didn't think you'd fight back like that. We didn't know who you were." Stallone took a deep breath. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears. He didn't want to feel pity. Not for these kids. Not after last night. But there was something hollow in their eyes now. Not anger, just hunger, just stupidity. Frankie stepped forward. "They got a can in the van?" The kid nodded. "Yeah, back seat." Pops muttered, "This is a bad idea." But Frankie was already grabbing the spare can strapped to the back of his bike. Stallone didn't stop him. He walked slowly to the van, opened the passenger door, and found the gas can where the kid said it'd be. He walked it back, poured half into the van's tank, then screwed the cap on tight. The boys just stood there, dumbfounded. No one said thank you. No one said a word. Stallone turned back to his Harley and mounted up, but before he put on his helmet, he looked at the kid with the scar and said, "Next time you think about robbing someone, ask yourself if they look like they've been through hell and come back. If they do, walk away." And with that, the engines roared back to life, and they rolled off toward the setting sun, leaving behind 4 stunned boys and a ghost of mercy they wouldn't soon forget. The sun dipped low behind the ridgeline as Stallone, Frankie, and Pops continued their ride east, cutting across the desert plains like ghosts on a final mission. The sky behind them flared with the colors of rust and blood orange, casting long shadows that chased their tires across the cracked and winding asphalt. They didn't talk much after leaving the stranded gang behind. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been lived. The road ahead was quiet, but the kind of quiet that buzzed with unspoken things. It had been years since Stallone had been on a ride this long. Years since he'd let the wind tear across his face without a camera watching or a schedule waiting. There was something healing in the way the highway swallowed the hours. Something honest in the drone of the motor and the feel of the leather gloves around the grips. But still, the silence weighed on him. Not because of regret, but because of the simple truth that the world had changed. Kids pulled knives before they asked questions. They threw punches instead of earning their stripes. And somewhere along the way, respect got lost between hashtags and headlines. Just outside the Utah border, the trio pulled into a small town called Baker. Not much more than a gas station, a diner, and a few rusted-out trucks leaning into the wind. They gassed up in silence, Frankie topping off the tank, while Pops went inside to grab bottled water and a couple of protein bars. Stallone stood near the edge of the lot, eyes scanning the horizon, ears tuned to the wind. He didn't trust the calm. Not after that encounter. Not after the sheriff's warning back in Ely. He watched the road behind them, as if the desert might spit something out again. And it did. A few minutes later, a black pickup truck rolled slowly into the station, dented along the passenger side, one headlight flickering. Stallone stiffened. He recognized the driver immediately, the scarred kid from the highway. But now he was alone. No buddies, no bandana. Just that same nervous twitch in his jaw, and a look in his eyes that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't peace either. He parked near the pumps but made no move to get out. Stallone didn't approach. He waited. After a long pause, the kid opened the door and stepped out, his palms visible, empty. "I'm not here to fight," he said, voice cracking under the weight of too many bad decisions. "Just needed to say something." Frankie emerged from around the pump, one hand on his hip, scanning for threats. Pops came out of the store, stopped short, and narrowed his eyes. "You lost, Junior?" The kid didn't react. He looked only at Stallone. "I know I blew it. We all did. But what you said back there, about knowing if someone's been through hell, it's stuck." He looked down at the pavement. "We weren't just trying to rob you. I mean, yeah, we were. But it wasn't about hate. It was about being broke, forgotten, angry." Stallone crossed his arms, his voice calm but solid. "You think that gives you a right to take what others earned?" The kid shook his head slowly. "Number, I know that now. I just wanted you to know I see it. I see what I didn't before. You didn't have to help us, but you did." Pops scoffed, walked past the kid like he didn't exist, and began strapping the bars to the saddlebag. Frankie stayed quiet, just watching. Stallone stepped forward a little, the gravel crunching under his boots. "You gonna fix it, or just talk about seeing it?" The kid's jaw tightened. "I don't know how. I was in juvie at 16. Been in and out of dead-end jobs since. Nobody ever taught me anything about fixing things. Just surviving." Stallone nodded once. Not in agreement, but in understanding. "Then start with this. Go home. Get away from the crew. Find one person who will hold you accountable. Doesn't have to be family. Doesn't have to be a preacher. Just someone who doesn't lie to you." The kid swallowed hard, eyes glistening for just a moment before he looked away. "I will." He turned toward his truck, then stopped and looked back. "You were Rocky, right?" Stallone raised an eyebrow. "I still am." The truck drove off without fanfare, just the low rumble of worn tires on asphalt fading into the dusk. No chase, no threats, just something like closure. Stallone turned back to the others. Pops was already on his bike, adjusting the mirrors. Frankie said nothing, but his nod said everything. They rode out of Baker just as the last light of day dipped behind the mountains. The road climbed into the foothills, winding through canyons cut by time and wind, and the night pressed in around them. They didn't speak for miles, each man alone in his thoughts. But then, somewhere near a canyon turnout, Stallone eased off the throttle and pulled over. Frankie and Pops followed. He stepped off the bike slowly, took a few paces toward the edge of the lookout where the whole valley unfolded beneath them, the moon rising above it like a quiet sentinel. "You ever think we'd still be doing this?" he asked, not looking back. Pops let out a chuckle that turned into a cough. "At this age, I figured I'd be teaching my grandkids how to fish, not dodging wrenches in the desert." Frankie took a swig from his flask, wiped his mouth with his sleeve. "Can't complain? It still feels right." Stallone nodded slowly. "It does, but sometimes it feels like we're the last of something. The last ones who learned how to earn a punch, how to stand our ground without looking for applause." Silence followed, heavy and shared. Then he added softer, "The world moves fast. But some things, some values, they don't need to." After a long pause, he pulled out a small object from his jacket pocket, a worn, dog-eared photo of 3 young men standing by their bikes, sun in their faces, grins wide. One of them, long gone now, had died in a car accident 15 years back. Stallone had been carrying that picture every ride since. "He would have loved this road," Stallone said, voice husky. "He was the first to push me out here. Said if you ever feel lost, just follow the line on the asphalt until you find yourself again." Pops clapped him on the shoulder. "You think we've found it yet?" Stallone folded the photo and slid it back into his jacket. "Maybe, or maybe the search is the point." They stood there for another minute, just breathing in the desert air, letting the silence say the rest. The ride into the night was quiet, smooth and steady. The moon overhead bathed the world in silver, and the road, so long, so uncertain, now felt like home. They didn't know where they'd stop next. Maybe a roadside bar in Torrey, maybe a cabin in the mountains. It didn't matter. The road had given them something they didn't even know they needed. Not just adrenaline or memories, but the reminder that even in a broken world, there were still moments of grit, grace, and second chances. Somewhere behind them, a young man was driving away from who he used to be. And somewhere ahead, the horizon waited with open arms. Stallone gripped the handlebars tighter, twisted the throttle, and felt the wind rush past like a heartbeat. He wasn't running from anything. He wasn't chasing anything either. He was just moving forward, mile by mile, in a world that still had room for men like him, weathered, wiser, and still standing.